Prologue. On the evening of Wednesday, October 25th, 1944, 2,000 people were shut out of Carnegie Hall. Crowded onto the New York City sidewalk, some waved $20 bills in an effort to persuade their way in, even though the most expensive tickets, long since sold out, officially cost $3. They could only watch as Cole Porter walked through the doors of the most hallowed concert hall in America, there to be joined by the superstar soprano Lily Pons and the queen of burlesque, Gypsy Rose Lee. Some say they saw Tallulah Bankhead swan in, too. The old hall also swarmed with journalists, eager to witness a phenomenon. The night before, Frank Sinatra was on the same stage at an election rally in support of President F.D. Roosevelt. The night after, the New York Philharmonic Orchestra performed under the baton of Artur Rodzinski. But on October 25th, it was the turn of Florence Foster Jenkins, a sizable woman of 76 who had recently released a series of recordings. It was these, including her versions of Mozart's Queen of the Night aria and Delibes' Indian Bell Song, which created such a feverish thirst to be there. The evening has no real right to be remembered on so important a day in the history of the world. October 25th, 1944 is such a pivotal date that there's a whole book about it, One Day in a Very Long War, by John Ellis. In the Philippines, the Battle of Leyte Gulf became the largest naval conflict in history, in which, for the first time, the Imperial Japanese Navy deployed kamikaze suicide bombers against U.S. warships. In Europe, the last Romanian city under German occupation was liberated by Romanian and Soviet forces, who also pushed the Wehrmacht from their Norwegian base in Kirkenes, while Bomber Command and the U.S. Air Force took part in daylight raids against Essen, Hamburg, and Hamburg. Meanwhile, back in New York, the cover of the recital program featured a photograph of a stately lady wearing, over short permed brown hair, a tiara with a diadem mounted in the center. A heavy necklace plunged past her low neckline toward two tentatively clasped hands. On her left hand was a thumb ring. Her eyes were beady and her jaw firm. On the mid-blue background and under black capitals blazing her name were the words Coloratura Soprano. Inside the program, bona fides advertised of previous triumphs. Madame Jenkins, as she liked to be known, possesses a marked individuality in style and piquancy in her interpretations. So reported the New York Journal-American. A Dr. B.B. James, publication unattributed, confirmed that a recent audience in the federal capital included persons in the political, cultural, and intellectual society of Washington, all of them critically minded hearers. The New York Daily Mirror hailed a personage of authority and indescribable charm, whose annual recitals bring unbounded joy. These notices were in accordance with more or less everything that had ever been written about Lady Florence, another of her preferred modes of address. She had been singing to select audiences since the 1910s, mostly in the protected world of the women's clubs, which flourished in great profusion in New York City from the turn of the century. In 1917, she founded her own society and called it the Verdi Club, to whose members she later began singing in an annual recital in the ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Press coverage was not solicited other than from the Musical Courier, a trade paper whose friendly discretion could be relied upon. Indeed, bought. The recitals acquired a cult following, and apart from the odd exuberant heckler, for years no one publicly said the salient and obvious thing about Florence Foster Jenkins. that she was a remarkably talentless singer. Instead, they cheered and clapped and stifled their guffaws by stuffing handkerchiefs in their mouths. In 1941, those recordings introduced her feeble voice and drastic pitching to a wider public, and word started to travel. Then came Carnegie Hall. Supported by a pianist, a flautist, and a string quartet, she proceeded to massacre a variety of tunes in a variety of preposterous costumes. The 3,000 who crammed Carnegie Hall as it had never been crammed before raised such a commotion that her accompanist, Cosme Macmillan, judged the recital the most remarkable thing that has happened there. Her assault on the famous aria from the Magic Flute had all the trappings of a brilliant comedic tour de force as she persistently failed to reach the stipulated notes. But it wasn't meant to be funny, any more than her rendition of Clavelitos, a short, flirtatious song in the Hispanic idiom which pushed the audience to fresh peaks of hysteria. As Florence lobbed rosebuds into the audience from a basket on her arm, one uncontrollable actress had to be removed from her box. In such a frenzied atmosphere, it is hard to imagine anyone creating enough of a disturbance to warrant ejection, and yet apparently it happened. The instant demand for an encore meant that poor Macmillan had to make his way down into the stalls to retrieve the flowers. The pleasure, and the pain, was even more intense the second time round, and throughout the evening Madame Jenkins interpreted the gales of laughter and waves of applause as a genuine acknowledgment of her art. Afterwards, her guests mingled with her on stage. "Don't you think I had real courage to sing the Queen of the Night again?" she said to one of them, "after that wonderful recording I made of it at the studio." The next morning, news spread far across the United States. Madame Jenkins, if you hadn't heard, and the chances are you haven't, is a lady who gives song recitals because there's no law against it. That was the Milwaukee Journal. She takes the songs that bring out the best in Lily Pons and permits them to bring out her worst. And the worst of Madame Jenkins, you are herewith assured, is something awful. Earl Wilson of the New York Post reported that Florence Foster Jenkins could sing anything but notes. "Hey, you music lovers," ran the headline above his report, "I heard Madame Jenkins." Describing her recital as one of the weirdest mass jokes New York has ever seen, his column, he was not a music journalist, pondered the discrepancy between the serious demeanor of the performer and the unbridled jollity of the audience. On the way out, Wilson bumped into a man he described as the singer's personal representative, whose name he transcribed as Clair Bayfield. "Why?" Wilson asked. "She loves music," said Clair Bayfield, an Englishman in his late 60s who for many years had been a minor Broadway actor. There was only one question Wilson could ask next. "If she loves music, why does she do this?"